McGraw-Hill, Living with Art, 13th edition, Part 1, Chapter 3, Themes of Art. Chapter outline: the sacred realm, politics and the social order, stories and histories, picturing the here and now, reflecting on the self, invention and fantasy, the natural world, art about art and its institutions. The sacred realm. Art has played an important role in our relationship with the sacred. The sacred realm. Who made the universe? How did life begin? And what is its purpose? What happens to us after we die? For answers to those and other fundamental questions, people throughout history have turned to a world we cannot see except through faith, the sacred realm. Gods and goddesses, ancestors, nature spirits, one God and one alone, each society has formed its own view of the sacred realm and how it interacts with our own. Some forms of faith have disappeared into history. Others have remained small and local, while still others, such as Christianity and Islam, have become major religions with believers all over the world. From earliest times, art has played an important role in our relationship with the sacred, helping us to envision it, to honor it, and to communicate with it. Many works of architecture have been created to provide settings for rituals of worship and prayer, rituals that formalize contact between the earthly and the divine realms. One such work is the small marvel known as Sainte-Chapelle, or Holy Chapel, in Paris. The chapel was commissioned in 1239 by the Catholic King of France, Louis IX, to house an important collection of relics that he had just acquired. He believed the relics to include pieces of the true cross, the crown of thorns, and other instruments of Christ's passion. The king's architects created a soaring vertical space whose walls seemed to be made of stained glass. Even today, light passing through the glass creates a dazzling effect, transforming the interior into a radiant, otherworldly space in which the glory of heaven seems close at hand. The Sainte-Chapelle is a relatively intimate space, for it was intended as a private chapel for the king and his court. In contrast, the great mosque of Cordoba in Spain was built to serve the needs of an entire community. A mosque is an Islamic house of worship. Begun in the 18th century, a great mosque at Cordoba grew to be the largest place of prayer in Western Islam. The interior of the prayer hall is a vast horizontal space measured out by a forest of columns. Daylight enters through the doorways placed around the perimeter of the hall. Filtered through the myriad columns and arches, it creates a complex play of shadows that makes the extent and shape of the interior hard to grasp. Alternating red and white stones break up the visual continuity with arch forms. Oil lamps that once hung in the front focal point of worship offered flickering light, reflecting off the gold ornamentation and creating more dancing shadows. In both the Sainte-Chapelle and the Great Mosque at Cordoba, architects strove to create a place where worshippers might approach the sacred realm. The builders of the Sainte-Chapelle envisioned a radiant, vertical space transformed by colored light, whereas the architects of the Great Mosque at Cordoba envisioned a vast horizontal space with rows of columns to organize the interior and accommodate the faithful. In both buildings, the everyday world is shut out, and the light and space are used to create a heightened sense of mystery and wonder. Our next two images, one Buddhist and one Christian, were made at approximately the same time, but some 4,000 miles apart. The Buddhist image is from Tibet, and the Christian one is from Italy. The content of the Buddhist painting is Rathananshambhava, one of the 5 transcendent Buddhas, seated in the pose of meditation on a stylized lotus throne. Many of his iconic details are similar to the Amitabha Buddha from the last chapter. He has an ushina and sits in meditative pose. His right hand makes the gesture of bestowing vows, his left the gesture of meditation. Unlike other Buddhas, however, the 5 transcendent Buddhas are typically portrayed in the bejeweled garb of the Indian prince. Rather than just featuring elongated earlobes arranged around the Brahmanansabhava are bodhisattvas, also in princely attire. Bodhisattvas are enlightened beings who have deferred their ultimate goal of nirvana, freedom from the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, in order to help others attain that goal. All wear halos signifying their holiness. The Buddha, being the most important of the personages depicted, dominates the painting as the largest figure. His face is straight forward in a pose of tranquility, while the others around him stand or sit in relaxed poses. The content of the second example, painted by the 13th century Italian master Cimbu, is a portrait of the Virgin Mary, the Mother of Christ, and she is with her son. While in the last chapter we saw the Christ child adored by shepherds, in this painting the infant and his mother sit tranquilly on a throne. The gold background places them in the heavenly realm. Mary's right hand indicates the Christ child. Like the Radha Shambhava, the Christ child makes a symbolic hand gesture, raising 2 fingers in a gesture of blessing. On both sides of Mary are figures of angels, heavenly spirit messengers, again all wearing shimmering gold halos as symbols of their holiness. As in the Buddhist painting, the most important personages dominates the composition, and is the largest figure, and holds a serenely frontal pose. The sacred realm. Architecture provides settings for religious rituals based on the ideas and needs of each faith. Architecture provides settings for religious rituals based on the ideas and needs of each faith. Architecture provides settings for religious rituals based on the ideas and needs of each faith. Example 1, the interior upper chapel of the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, 1243 through 1248. Example 2 of the ways in which architecture provides setting for religious rituals based on the needs of each faith. The interior of the Great Mosque in Cordoba, Spain, beginning in 786 CE. The sacred realm. Art has created images of sacred beings. Art has created images of sacred beings. Example 1. Buddha of South Tibet, 13th century CE, opaque watercolor on cloth. Example 2 of the ways in which art has created images of sacred beings. And the third example of art that has created images of sacred beings is this large Buddha in Afghanistan. The sacred realm. Some religions profit making images of sacred beings. Politics and the social order. Art has celebrated and promoted the power of rulers even after death. In many early societies, the cosmic order was interrelated with the social and political order of rulers, citizens, and government institutions. Such was the case in ancient Egypt, where the pharaoh, or king, was viewed as a link between the divine and the earthly realms. The pharaoh was considered a junior god, a personification of God, Horus and the son of the sun god Ra. As a ruler, his role was to maintain the divinely established order of the universe, which included the social order of Egypt. He communed with the gods in temples only he could enter, and he wielded theoretically unlimited power over a country that literally belonged to him. When a pharaoh died, it was believed that he rejoined the gods and became fully divine. Preparations for this journey began even during his lifetime, as vast tombs were constructed and outfitted with everything he would need to maintain his royal lifestyle in eternity. The most famous of these monuments are the 3 pyramids at Giza, which served as tombs of the pharaohs Mentuke and Khafre and Khufu. Thousands of years later, the scale of these structures is still awe-inspiring. The largest pyramid originally reached the height of about 480 feet. roughly the height of a 50-story skyscraper. Its base covers more than 13 acres. More than 2 million blocks of stone, each weighing over 2 tons, went into building it. Each block had to be quarried with hand tools, transported to the site, and set in place without mortar. Tens of thousands of workers labored for years to build such a tomb and to fill its chambers with treasures. Art has celebrated and promoted the power of rulers even after death. Example 2. Before our modern mass media, art projected the presence of authority of rulers to the people throughout their lands. During the days of the Roman emperor, an official likeness of a new emperor was circulated throughout the realm so that local sculptors could get busy making statues for public places and civic buildings. The Augusta of Primorta, a marble copy of a bronze one created around 20 BCE, is a portrait of Augustus Caesar, the first emperor of the Roman Empire. Like all portraits, the sculpture captures the likeness of a living individual, showing us Augustus's deep eyes, small chin, and prominent ears. The portrait is probably idealized, made to make the emperor more handsome and more robust. His muscular and perfectly proportioned body shows no sign of aging or battle scars. Instead, Augustus is the model of might and political authority. Politics and the social order. Art has challenged the power of rulers and the established social order. Art has challenged the power of rulers and the established social order. During the often violent transition into our modern era, art remained deeply involved with politics and social order. The perspectives of artists changed profoundly, however. Instead of exclusively serving those in power, the artist was now a citizen among other citizens, and free to make art that took sides in the political debates of the day. Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People leaves no doubt about the artist's support for the Revolution of 1830, a popular uprising in Paris that toppled one government and installed another. Delacroix completed the naturalistic painting in the very same year, and it retains the passion of his idealized view of the insurrection and hopes he had for the future it would bring. At the center is Liberty herself, personified as a Greek statue come to life. Holding the French flag high, she rallies the citizens of Paris who surge towards us, brandishing pistols and sabers as though about to burst through the painting, and before them lies the bodies of the slain government troops. Where Delacroix glorified violence in the service of democracy in Liberty Leading the People, Pablo Picasso condemned a violent episode unleashed by fascists against ordinary citizens in this painting. This painting depicts an event that took place during the Spanish Civil War, when a coalition of conservative and fascist forces led by General Francisco Franco fought to topple the liberal government of the fledgling Spanish Republic. In Germany and Italy, the fascist governments of Hitler and Mussolini were already in power. Franco willingly accepted their aid, and in exchange he allowed the Nazis to test their developing air power. On April 26, 1937, the Germans bombed a town in Guernica, the old Basque capital in northern Spain. There was no real military reason for the raid. It was simply an experiment to see whether aerial bombing could wipe out an entire city. Being totally defenseless, Guernica was left devastated, and its civilian population was massacred. Stories and histories. Storytelling in art has been used to effect change. Storytelling in art has been used to effect change. Deeds of heroes, tragic legends, folk tales passed down through generations, episodes of television shows that everyone knows by heart, shared stories are one of the ways we create a sense of community. Artists have often turned to stories for subject matter, especially stories whose roots reach deep into the culture's collective memory. When images tell a story, we say that they are narrative. Storytelling to effect social change is at the heart of William Hogarth's art. The print seen here is the first image in a series of 6 prints titled A Harlot's Progress. The image introduces us to an innocent country girl, Mary Hackabout, who has arrived in London. The, the parson who was to serve as Mary's guardian in the city appears befuddled in the background, leaving Mary to be met by an older woman. Unfortunately, the older woman runs a brothel and recruits Mary into prostitution. A series of tragedies ensues, and the story ends with Mary's death after serving time in prison. Stories and histories. Storytelling in art has been used to record history. Artist Frank Henderson told the story of his people in Off to War. The Arapaho people lived in the mountains and the plains of the western United States until the Anglo-American incursion forced them onto a reservation in Oklahoma Territory in 1867. Henderson recorded this history in a series of drawings as his people's horse-based culture was converted to an agrarian society and confined within the boundaries of a reservation. In Off to War, Henderson depicts two warriors leaving for battle. They wear traditional regalia, and their horses are charged excitingly across the page. Plains artists had previously made images like this on their teepees, depicting significant events and celestial symbols in stylized line drawings. Once restricted to the reservations, artists turned to a different material. Henderson made his narrative drawings on a ledger, a bound book made for recording financial transactions. Ledger drawings by Henderson and other artists recorded the history of their communities, and these images remain an important source for understanding the histories of Native peoples in America. History has furnished artists with many stories, for history itself is nothing more than a story that we tell ourselves about the past. A story we write and then rewrite. In Altar to the Chassis High School, Christian Boltanski relied on our memory of the historical episode known as the Holocaust, the mass murder of 6 million European Jews and other populations by the Nazis during World War II. Boltanski began with a photograph he found of the 1931 graduating class of Chassis, a private Jewish high school in Vienna. 18 years old in the photograph, the students would have been 25 when Austria was annexed by Germany at the start of the war. Most of them probably perished in death camps. Boltanski re-photographed each face, then enlarged the results into a series of abstract, blurry portraits. The effect is as though someone long ago were calling out to us. We try to recognize them, but cannot quite. Our task is made even more difficult by the lights blocking their faces, lights that serve as halos on the one hand, but also remind us of the interrogation lamps. We wonder, too, what the stacked tin boxes might hold. Ashes, possessions, documents. They have no labels, just as the blurred faces almost have no identities. Without many iconographic details, Boltanski's work tells the tragic story of the Holocaust on a very intimate and human scale. Stories and histories. Storytelling in art has been used to tell the stories of underrepresented communities. Storytelling in art has been used to tell the stories of underrepresented communities, as in this piece by Judith Becca and her team of artists. Becca's Great Wall of Los Angeles is a half-a-mile-long history of the area from the prehistory to the 20th century. Paintings that represent important moments from history are called history paintings. They usually picture wars, rulers, or even religious and mythological events that have been unfolded into the cultural memory. But the goal of Becca's ongoing project is to represent the histories of the diverse populations of Los Angeles who are underrepresented in the history books and in the school curriculum. Becca collaborates with historians and artists to picture these events that have received little attention despite deeply affecting people's lives. The scene shown here represents the roles of Asians and Latinos on the frontier in the 19th century. To picture how the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo that brought California and the Southwest Territories into the United States split the region's Latino populations, Becca paints two writers pulling apart the map. Because storytelling is public, it recalls Mexican murals of the 20th century that made similarly strong political and social statements. As of today, the Great Wall of Los Angeles is the longest mural painting in the world, and it is still growing. Stories and histories. Storytelling in art has been used to make us think differently about historical events. Storytelling in art has been used to make us think differently about historical events. Stories and histories. Storytelling in art sometimes interprets works of literature. Art can produce a range of emotions in viewers, and it doesn't always have to be beautiful. In addition to representing history, art can also give visual form to stories from literary sources. A project by the Iranian-born artist Shirishin Neshat uses a series of 5 large-scale videos to tell stories inspired by Women Without Men, a novel by a contemporary Iranian writer. Women Without Men is about a small group of women who live briefly together in a house with a large garden not far from the Iranian capital. They come together by chance, each one having suffered and then escaped the world of male authority. Each of Neshat's brief videos presents one woman's story from the book, but it does not retell the story literally. Rather, it meditates freely on the story's events, themes, and imagery. Repeating imagery links in the videos in subtle ways, as does the choice of actors, some of whom play more than one role across the series. Shown in a gallery or museum space, the videos are projected onto the walls, each in its own room. Viewers can wander from one to the other room in any order, further rewriting the story each time. Picturing the here and now. Art has been used to represent everyday life in genre scenes. Art has been used to represent everyday life in genre scenes. Genre scenes appear in art made around the world. Court ladies preparing newly woven silk is part of a long hand scroll painting made in China. It depicts women weaving, ironing, and folding the links of silk. The painting is a copy made during the 12th century of a famous 8th century work, which is now lost. In the scene, 4 ladies in their elegant robes stretch the length of silk. The woman facing us irons it with a flat-bottomed pan full of hot coals taken from the blazer visible at the right. Her companion holds the cloth taut while it is ironed. A little girl too small to share in the task clowns around. If this is a scene from everyday life, it is a very rarefied life indeed. These are ladies of the imperial court, and the painting is an exercise in showing their virtues and sense of domestic duty. Daily work is also the subject of a painting made in Mexico in 1575, entitled Featherworks. It is part of a manuscript known as the Florentine Codex. This bound book was written by Friar Bernardo de Sahagun, with the assistance of native Mexican artists and scholars. The text is in Spanish and in the Aztec language. As a missionary, the friar created the book as a general history of the indigenous peoples of Mexico. As he worked to convert them to Christianity, he recorded their traditional religious rituals, gods, and agriculture practices and arts. In this page, the artists make cloth and regalia out of brightly colored feathers, a highly treasured material in Aztec culture. They use whole feathers and individual barbs from birds that are kept in the ruler's private aviary. The artists select feathers for their color and for their iridescence. As a result, the objects shimmered in light, creating dazzling optical effects for the wearers as they moved. While the feather workers practiced their trade, in the illustration's upper section, examples of their work appear in 2 panels below. The bottom panel shows the feathers and fans and the staffs made with the green long feathers. Picturing the here and now. Artists interpret everyday life to change our perception of it. American artist Robert Rauschenberg found that the visual impact of daily life in New York in the 1960s had outgrown the ability of any single image to convey it. Instead, to communicate the energy and vitality of his time and place, Rauschenberg treated his canvas like a gigantic page in a scrapbook. The result is a kind of controlled chaos in which photographic images drawn from the many sources are linked by a poetic process of free association. Windward includes images of the Statue of Liberty, a bald eagle against a rainbow, the Sistine Chapel with Michelangelo's famous mural paintings in the upper left, sun-kissed oranges, Manhattan rooftops and their distinctive water tower in red, the building's facade, and the construction workers in plaid shirts and hard hats. This cacophony of images is busy and overwhelming. Treasuring Windward's visual and conceptual connections can build an appreciation of it. Reflecting on the self. Art invites viewers to reflect on the self. Reflecting on the self. Art can affirm our self-image. Art can affirm self-image. Art sometimes invites us to look inward and to think about ourselves and our place in the world. Seeing the spectacular Claudman silver dressing table and stool on display, it's hard to resist sitting down and gazing into the mirror. When it was made in 1899, dressing tables were an essential furnishing for a wealthy woman's bedroom. Seated at the table, the owner saw her reflection surrounded by finely hammered designs in a silver frame. The goddess Aurora, symbol of the dawn, appears at the top, while an owl with outstretched wings, representing the night, appears at the bottom. Nymphs, peacocks, flowers, and vines cover the frame, and swans cap the table's legs at the end of the clawed feet. Made of solid silver for display in Paris at the 1900 Universal Exposition, the dressing table, an extravagant statement of wealth and privilege and status, was purchased by an American businessman. Reflecting on the self. Art can reveal our inner selves. Art can reveal our inner selves. Painter Alice Neal's portrait of the artist Andy Warhol, on the other hand, does not flatter its subject. Warhol sits uncomfortably with his eyes closed. His shirtless torso reveals aged, sagging flesh and scars from a shooting 2 years earlier by one of his former collaborators. He wears a girdle to support the wounded area, but below the waist his plain brown pants and shoes and clasped hands contradict Warhol's public identity as a rule-breaking artist who rubbed elbows with celebrities. Neal pictures him as a frail and vulnerable human, sitting quietly near the edge of a seat with his arms and legs pulled in, as if he were trying not to take up space. Alice Neal brought a sensitive and penetrating perspective to her portraits. Working with the mid-20th century, she sought the humanity of her subjects, who ranged from well-known labor leaders and activists to anonymous working-class individuals. For each, Neal focused on evoking feelings rather than realistic details. She abstracted the figures for expressive effects, exaggerating the size of the eyes as windows into the soul. In this case, she closed Warhol's eyes and made him pale and thin, forcing us to ask which was the real Andy Warhol, the avant-garde artist who acted aloof and partied in New York City dance clubs, or the frail, scarred, middle-aged man. We can ask a similar question of the two Fridas, a double self-portrait by the Mexican painter Frida Kahlo. We see Carla twice, staring out at us with her characteristic thick eyebrows. On the left, Carla wears a lacy white dress decorated with birds and flowers. Echoing their red color, blood drips onto the skirt from a clamped vein emerging from her exposed heart. The vein continues over her shoulder to the heart of the second self-portrait, tying these two figures in their mirrored poses and clasped hands. Carla, on the right, wears a colorful traditional garment from southern Mexico. Resting in her lap, her left hand holds a small framed picture, a childhood portrait of Carla's husband, painter Diego Rivera. Like the clamp that cannot stop the flow of blood, the small portrait rests over Carlo's lower abdomen, visually linking Carlo Riviera and her ancestry's fertility and suffering. Carlo began to paint while recovering from a streetcar accident that left her body shattered and unable to bear children. She would experience periods of crippling pain for the rest of her life and would undergo dozens of operations. She painted self-portraits throughout her career, often representing herself at the center of an image, regarding viewers coolly, skeptically, or perhaps she's looking at herself. In the two Fritas, her wardrobes show her European roots and her Mexican ancestry. Rarely constrained by reality, Carlo nevertheless rejected interpretations of her paintings as dreamlike. "I never painted dreams," she said. "I paint my own reality." Invention and fantasy. Artists use invention and fantasy to affect their viewers' thoughts and emotions. Inventive and fantastic art can reflect the artist's beliefs and feelings. Artists use invention and fantasy to affect their viewers' thoughts and emotions. One of the most inventive artists who wielded a brush was the Netherlandish painter Hieronymus Bosch. When we first encounter his Garden of Earthly Delights, we might think we have wandered into a fun house of a particularly macabre kind. The Garden of Earthly Delights is the central and largest panel of a triptych, a painting of 3 sections. The 2 outer sections, painted both front and back, can close like a pair of shutters over the central image. Closed, they depict the creation of the world. Open, they illustrate the earthly paradise of Eden and hell. Between Eden and hell, Bosch sets the Garden of Earthly Delights, which depicts the false paradise of love. False because, although deeply pleasurable, it can lead humanity away from the bonds of marriage and towards the deadly sin of lust and damnation. Hundreds of nude humans cavort in fantasy landscape inhabited by giant plants and outsized birds and animals. The people are busy and inventive in the things they do and with one another and with the animals and plants. They seem to be having a fun time. But their goings-on are so strange that we are both intrigued and repelled by them. Can these truly be delights? While Bosch imagined an earthly paradise, Giovanni Battista Piranesi created a subterranean dungeon using a printmaking technique known as etching. He created these 16 prints in a series and explained that they were capricious inventions from his own imagination. The etchings picture a dark prison of ambiguous spaces, stairways to nowhere, and soaring dark vaults. We see this architecture from a low vantage point, which emphasizes its size. Piranesi filled his frightening spaces with machines and tiny figures. After printing an initial run or state of prints, Piranesi returned to his images and made them even darker and more ominous, like the ones seen here. He added chains, ladders, and spiked objects that looked like torture devices. Piranesi drew these additional elements with slashing strokes, with the result that the form adds to the scary content. Piranesi likely created these etchings to evoke emotions in response to the Enlightenment's celebration of reason. Piranesi's work anticipates the movement known as Romanticism that would soon offer stories of monsters like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Henri Rousseau had a far more benign imagination. Rousseau worked in France during the late 19th and 20th century. He was acquainted with all of the up-and-coming artists of the Parisian scene, but opted for an unschooled style. He never left France or visited a jungle like the one seen in Dream. Rousseau assembled his vision from illustrated books and magazines and from sketching trips to the zoo, the Natural History Museum, and especially the Paris Botanical Garden. In what was his last painting, Rousseau placed a young woman in his invented jungle. Reclining nude on a velvet sofa, she seems unsurprised to find herself among the stylized foliage and surrounded by musicians and observed by animals. The natural world. Landscapes represent the natural world. Landscapes represent the natural world. Images that represent a view of the natural world are called landscapes, or seascapes when they represent the ocean. Landscapes may be careful renderings of the terrain as observed by the artist and products of the imagination. In the Chinese painting tradition, landscape is the most important and honored subject, but its purpose was not about recording the details of a particular site or view. Rather, painters learned to paint mountains, rocks, trees, and water so that they could construct imaginary landscapes for viewers to wander in their minds. In Wang Jian's Shades of Pine in a Cloudy Valley, we might paddle up the river, visit a house nestled in a shoreline, or take a broad path to depart to a village in the distance. We are free to move around the painting because there is no fixed point of view. Instead, the artist suspends us in midair like a bird. Nature has been more than a subject for art. It has also served as a material for art. Spiral jetty is what's called an earthwork, a work of art made in the earth itself or created with natural materials and placed into nature. American artist Robert Smithson constructed his earthwork in 1970 in the Great Salt Lake, Utah. He had become fascinated with the ecology of salt lakes, especially with the microbacteria that tinged the water with shades of red. After viewing the Great Salt Lake in Utah, he leased a parcel of land on its shore and began work on his large coil of rock and earth. Smithson was drawn to the idea that the artist could participate in the shaping of landscape as almost like a geological force. Spiral jetty continued to change according to natural processes after it was finished. Salt crystals accumulated and sparkled on its edge. Depths of water in and around it took on different tints of transparent violet, pink, and red. Spiral jetty was submerged by the lake soon after it was created, but resurfaced in the early 2000s, transformed by a coating of salt crystals. As climate change takes a toll on the planet, artists have turned their attention to its effect on nature. Artist and scientist Shubhankar Banjari spent 2 years photographing Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. He captured the rich diversity of the terrain and its animals from the air and at ground level. Banjari took the photograph Caribou Migration 1 from an airplane, recording the movement of animals across the snow and ice. The photograph is large and invites us to look closely. It was taken in May as a pregnant caribou made their way across the seasonal calving grounds. They appear small against the vast landscape and form 3 delicate lines intersecting the blue ice river. The photograph lets us see what cannot be seen from the ground as we witness a migration that has occurred without human involvement for centuries. Banjari's photographs so effectively capture the region's wilderness and fragility that it was used in the U.S. Senate debates over drilling in the refuge. The natural world. Earthworks shape nature into art. Earthworks shape nature into art. The natural world. Representing nature can be a political act. Representing nature can be a political act. Art about art and its institutions. Art can focus on process to explore issues of authorship, originality, and identity. Art sometimes turns its attention to art itself, making art, looking at art, finding the meaning and purpose of art. Diego Velázquez created his masterpiece, The Maids of Honor, as a court painter for the Spanish king. He placed himself into the work and into the process of painting. Scholars debate what he might be painting. Perhaps it is the portrait of the young princess, who stands regally at the center, surrounded by her attendants. Or perhaps Velázquez is painting the king and queen, whom we see reflected in a mirror on the far wall. Whatever the case, the king admired the painting and hung it in the royal palace. He even honored the artist with a knighthood in the Order of St. James, leading Velázquez to return to painting and to add the order's red insignia on his chest. Artists learn to make art by looking at art. They look at the art of the past to learn about their predecessors, and they look at the art of the present to situate themselves amid their peers. Contemporary Japanese artist Yasumasa Morimura vividly illustrates this process. His photographs recreate well-known works from European and American art history with insertions of himself into the images. His 2013 Drawn by Distant Light, Awakened to Darkness copies Velazquez's artistic choices: composition, coloring, lighting, figures, and dress. Morimura also includes his self-portrait, as Velazquez did, but not just once. Every figure in Morimura's photograph is a self-portrait. The artist, dressed as each character, photographed himself and later assembled the photographs into a single image. He even recreated the princess painting inside the gallery at the Madrid's Prado Museum, where the original painting hangs. Velazquez's work is visible in the background. Morimura appropriated the Spanish artist's painting and transformed it into something new, but his work, like Duchamp's fountain, raises questions about the artist's role in the work of art. Who owns the idea, and what is originality? Art about art and its institutions. Art comments on the institutions of the art world to draw attention to problems. Just as art sometimes looks at itself, it also considers institutions that collect, house, and display art. While art collectors, museums, and galleries play essential roles in the art world, they also have histories of questionable practices, ranging from plundering art to excluding women and artists of color from their collections. The activist group known as Guerrilla Girls formed in 1985, shortly after the opening of a huge exhibition at the New York Museum of Modern Art. The show, titled International Survey of Contemporary Painting and Sculpture, included works by 169 artists, yet fewer than 10% of the artists were women. The Guerrilla Girls, an anonymous group of women artists, protested the absence of women from this and similar exhibitions. They produced a poster that asked in bold type, "What do these artists have in common?" Underneath were the names of 42 prominent artists, all male. The poster text continued, "They all allow their work to be shown in galleries that show no more than 10% women or none at all." More posters followed. One asked, "Do women have to be naked to get into the Met?" and noted the underrepresentation of women artists in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection. The poster uses a photograph of a painting by a 19th century French artist, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, to represent the abundance of women's bodies displayed in museums. A gorilla mask, like the one the Guerrilla Girls wear in public appearances, is superimposed over her head. The poster drew immediate attention, partly because of the design and partly because of the Guerrilla Girls' aura of mystery. The fact that the group remains active today reveals that there still is work to do on the level of the art world's playing field. And this concludes Chapter 3.